Over the past 5 years almost, I've been researching COVID 19 and looking at the clinical presentation of the disease. And so I have a unique perspective on what is happening, what is likely to happen, and why it is happening. And so you're going to be getting some cutting edge insights here that I doubt you will hear from anywhere else. As long as they allow me to continue to explain the science, even though some of it may be inconvenient, you will learn a lot about what is happening and critically what you can do to protect yourself. Why am I making mention at the moment of Ursula von der Leyen? She is currently the president of the European Commission and she has severe pneumonia. Now, she's not a young person, but she's not very old either. She's only about 66 years old. And if I were able to speak to her, if she was listening, or if any of her people were listening, I would say, I think it's important to reflect carefully on what's happening in your personal situation and to see that this is likely to be relevant across the whole of Europe and possibly the Western world. I had recently spoken about China and the virus that had been circulating there, along with influenza and mycoplasma and so on. And people thought that there is an issue with China that's putting the rest of the world at risk. No, not in the least. China is just talking about it at the moment. But if you go to any major hospital at this point in the year, I think you're likely to see exactly the same replication of issues that are occurring across the board. This is a pretty serious problem that we have to find ways to address. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you why I think that her presentation is likely or potentially connected to COVID and what it means for you and how you should approach your health into this period here as we come to a number of challenges. As usual, before I start, I want to remind you about Disease X. It just so happened that this number one bestseller on Amazon, which surprisingly is being suppressed, is exactly what you need to hear now. And if you want just an excerpt of it, you can put your email in here and we'll give you a free chapter so you can see the style of the book. Some people, when they click on here to purchase on Amazon, are unable to get it. Don't worry. We're finding ways that you will be able to get this information. Clearly, it's something that's important that they don't want people to know. Very sad. Additionally, coming up again in a short period of time is Autoimmunity 101, the body's mysterious attack on itself. And the reason I'm doing this presentation is simply because I realize so few people understand when I speak about autoimmunity and the link to COVID 19. They don't even understand the concept and how important it is, especially with viral diseases triggering autoimmune responses. I think that this is a very serious issue that is going to come up over the next 5 to 10 years. The more you understand about it, the better you will be to face the challenges ahead. So let's get back to this story. So this was published in the Political, and it highlights the fact that the European Commission president cancels engagements in Lisbon after falling ill. And they said that this was after contracting pneumonia. Okay. Now, and she's canceled her external engagements for the first 2 weeks of January. And she is dealing with severe pneumonia. This suggests that she may be quite unwell. It doesn't mean that she's in hospital, but she may be quite unwell with it. And what I've done is I've grabbed some information from the NHS here, looking at chest infections. It's an infection of the lungs or the large airways. Some are mild and clear up on their own, but others can be quite severe and life threatening. And in her cases, she may be in between, which is not mild, may not be severe because she's potentially not in hospital, but it may be moderate enough to knock her down. And as they said, often follow colds or flu. Now, this is very important here. because, especially in the context of the cold here, I'm talking about COVID. The flu, even the COVID, I think predisposes to it. And very often, what happens to people is if they get a viral infection of the lungs, a viral pneumonia, what can then happen is you get secondary bacterial infection. And that means is that because of damage from the virus, you then have bacteria in the lungs already, then able to cause infection. And so, therefore, the person sometimes may need both antivirals and antibacterial antibiotics in order to manage the infection. It varies from person to person. Not everybody needs antibiotics if it's clearly a viral pneumonia, but the point is that's where your doctor comes in to make that judgment. And they're talking about here the chesty cough, people coughing up green or yellow mucus, some wheezing, shortness of breath, chest pain, high temperature, headache, aching muscles, tiredness. But as usual, they oftentimes get better in about 7 to 10 days, but you can continue to have symptoms for up to 3 weeks. And they highlight that you need to get plenty of rest, drink lots of water, keep your head up, use painkillers, and they even recommend a hot lemon and honey drink to relieve sore throat. And as usual, don't smoke, don't breathe steam, and don't give aspirin to children under 16 years old. That's very good advice and really important in the context of where we are today and what is happening. But let me now break it down from my perspective as to what I think could be happening in terms of her situation and how it may be relevant to you in the context of post Christmas. That's the first thing that I'm starting with because we're on the 3rd of January. And the 3rd of January means that we are just about 10 days beyond Christmas Day. And as usual, what happens over Christmas is a lot of people congregate together, families come together, everybody from different parts of the country or the world. And invariably, some of them could be carrying along with them viral infections. Now, the truth is that when it comes to COVID, it's a different beast in terms of spreading because very often it is spreading asymptomatically. This is really so important. A lot of people don't understand this. They're saying, well, how can it be spreading asymptomatically? You just have to look at the data or the statistics. Now, this here is the example of SARS-CoV-2, the virus with the spike proteins of blue. It gets into the nasal passages, it binds to specific cells, it starts to replicate, and then it will go down into the lungs down here. Now, what's important is that because of how this virus operates, it suppresses your interferon response, and this is why you don't have any symptoms. Within 24 hours, it's spreading avidly with no symptoms. And by the time you reach 2 days, it's already causing inflammation in the lungs with minimal symptoms until the interferon response kicks in. And in that period of time, people will be breathing it out and inhaling it down. And so, of course, it will spread to other people. What you are trying to prevent is that you don't want it to break through your mucosal barrier and get into your systemic circulation, lymph nodes, and the bloodstream. That's where it changes from just being a benign virus into a very, very dangerous virus. And this is the bit that people don't quite get. A really important point. And let me break it down to you so that you understand what happens with COVID. Here is the breakdown. You have first, a lot of people have asymptomatic. It's actually not asymptomatic. It's what we call subclinical. They just didn't have many symptoms with it. Then you have another cohort who have a COVID bronchitis, where they have inflammation in the upper airway and they're coughing all the time. And sometimes this can go on for quite a while. And then you have a COVID viral pneumonia. That's where it's become more serious. They've got an infection in the lungs and most likely a secondary bacterial pneumonia along with it. Now, when it comes to moderate COVID and severe COVID, that is like the pneumonia plus microclotting. This is what I call the autoimmune beast. And this is what was killing people in the early part of the pandemic. But once the body is aware of the virus, and this happens through multiple ways, it can either be through people who've had infection, and even in the context of vaccination, it has an impact on the ability of the virus to evade the interferon response. And that's part of the reason why we don't see severe COVID 19 as often as we did before. It doesn't mean it's not happening, it's just not as frequent. But it is very important to note that the viral pneumonia is probably now the more serious part of the puzzle because it's still spreading quite avidly, especially in highly vaccinated regions, which is a little bit inconvenient. Now, as I said before, when you compare viruses, this virus is nothing like influenza or any of the other respiratory viruses. Most other respiratory viruses will stay in the lungs, not this one. When they looked at what happens when you inject the spike, oh my goodness, it goes throughout the whole body. This is a rat model: heart, kidneys, lungs, intestines, brain, blood vessels, literally everywhere. Compare this to influenza, largely concentrated in the lungs, and it's largely primarily a respiratory disease, which can sometimes have neurological manifestations. But this, goodness, don't underestimate it. We have never seen anything like this before. So it's very important when I'm speaking about it to understand that once it penetrates that barrier, it brings on a different thing. And this is now the bit that I was saying if I was talking to Ursula. My suspicion is that in just around the Christmas period, and this is just not her, I'm just using her as an example, that's when people get exposed to COVID because it's circulating so highly. You're in a closed space for a long period of time. Pretty good chance that if you have any predisposition to get it, you're going to get it. And the variants keep on evading some cohorts much better than others. But here's the thing that people don't get. Even though the symptoms are often mild with COVID, and this is the first bit, they oftentimes have mild symptoms, a bit of fatigue, maybe a little bit of cough, a little bit of sore throat. Everybody says, no big deal, and they move on. What they're not realizing is what's happening below the surface. This is essentially what it's doing to your immune system. I've got here a number of parts of your immune system. The T cells, the B cells, the natural killer cells tend to get impacted by the virus. And sometimes it's hard to get it across to people as to what it's like, because when you look at the blood tests, they're oftentimes all normal. So people would think, well, it's not as if I've got a lymphopenia or anything. The white blood cells are still there. The way I describe it is like what happens here. It's like a freeze gun, stun gun. So the COVID, the spike protein, almost disables these immune cells. They are still there, but they're not able to do anything. They're dysregulated. We don't know how many, but it could be a significant number. And in some people, it causes the numbers to drop off quite significantly, a lymphopenia. But this is the bit that now opens the doorways to other infections. And that's the bit that people don't quite get. And as I remind them, they have the mild symptoms. The mild symptoms then disable the immune system. That disability of the immune system opens the door for other things like influenza. And if you get influenza or RSV or the HPMV, this other one that's circulating, you can then end up with a pneumonia. And this here is the image of this bacterial pneumonia with inflammation in the lungs, causing that cough with the green sputum and so on. And depending on your capacity to handle that infection will determine your presentation. And from a clinical point of view, this is what it could look like. You'll have people coming into hospitals with that cough. Normally, the lungs are black. where there's a lot of air. The bones will light up as white. So these are the clavicles here. These are the vertebra down the middle. This is the heart here. But the lungs, usually, you'll notice most of this all the way down to here is black. And then you have this area here. This almost looks like a wedge, what we call a wedge-shaped consolidation. And this here could be a pneumonia that's affecting one part of the right lung. And this is what you could see on X-ray. And if you saw that, you'd oftentimes put the person on antibiotics because it would suggest that it's a bacterial pneumonia. And this is what it would probably look like if you were to cut open the lungs and look at the alveoli. These are the oxygen exchanging part of the lungs. They'll be full of mucus plugs with neutrophils, not quite pus, but these plugs of mucus, making it difficult for oxygen to be able to exchange. And this is why people will feel short of breath. And giving them the antibiotics gives the immune system a chance to recover. But this is the essence of what I think is happening. And in her case, if you were to look at the X-ray, and if it was something more like a COVID presentation, or if it was even something like mycoplasma, you could end up with this very different looking chest X-ray. As you remember with the pneumonia, this one here is normal. This is the pneumonia here, this white patch here in the right lung. And then this is the COVID picture. You see patches all the way through on both sides. And this is why it's so serious. This viral pneumonia plus microclotting can cause quite severe symptoms. And so in the case of the individual is that very often coming into early January now, after all that exposure with COVID and the disabling of the immune system, you now have an increased propensity for other viral infections. That's the bit to watch out for. And what I would have been telling people is that over that winter period, of that Christmas period, make sure you are supporting your immune system. That's the vitamin C, the zinc, the vitamin D. And then you would want to keep that going humming. As I've said before, that's talked about in the book, a really simple, innovative strategy that will disable viruses and bacteria in your upper airway and to an extent in your lungs just by using nitric oxide. This is the science that you need at this point to get you through it. Now, what oftentimes happens, and this is the caution, is that many people probably have good mucosal immunity and they have never had any symptoms. And they almost feel a sense of bravado. I would caution against that because you have to remember you're not just concerned about COVID, you're concerned about all the other viruses and bacteria that are circulating. And it doesn't take a lot to overwhelm an immune system, it's just not worth the risk. And so when we think about if this can be happening to the president of the EU Commission, you can imagine that this is happening across the board in many parts of the world. This is by no means a China issue. This is a global issue. Maybe not in Papua New Guinea. If you understand what I'm talking about, you'd understand why I said that. But in many parts of the Western world, this is largely going to be a serious issue. So this information is valuable, but if you want more insights on it, remember, get the book here, Are You Prepared Against Disease X, which is simply COVID plus all these other viral diseases. It is a great book to read. The information will be of value to you. And as well, if you want to join me for Autoimmunity 101, this is coming up on Thursday, the 16th of January. This should be valuable information to understand the characteristics of the immune system and why it's so dangerous at this time if autoimmunity characteristics are triggered. So thank you for joining me. As usual, as long as they will allow me, as they continue to try and restrict my information, I will bring you cutting edge insights with the explanation of the science. That's what I'm trying to do differently for 2025. There's no point worrying about what has been done in the past. Let's focus on the future and try and find solutions for everyone to help them to keep well into 2025. Have a great evening.